my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am talking about all of the series that I have not been finishing reading. For an SFF reader, I am terrible, just like absolutely terrible at finishing series, picking up sequels, any of it. It is the bane of my existence. I was thinking I'd been doing a decent job of it this year, reading more books that are sequels than normal for me. But really, I have not made a dent in my unfinished series, so here I am taking stock. This list I have put together, I'm going through all of the series that I am in the middle of where that fulfill all of the following criteria. One, there are books that I haven't read that have been published. So like nothing where I'm caught up and waiting for the publication of a new book. If there's a book that's already out and I haven't read it, it can go on this list. Two, these are series where I last read an entry in them in the past 3 years. There are absolutely series that I desperately want to finish where I last read a book in that series more than 3 years ago. At that point, I think I have to admit that I kind of should be doing a reread of those earlier books in order to continue that series. All of these, I think regardless of whether I should be doing a reread or not, I will not do a reread if I continue on with these series anytime soon. I will just like plow on and hope I remember stuff. And three, these are all series that I genuinely want to read the next books. There are a lot of series that I technically have read the first book or books, and there are circumstances under which I would continue those series. Most of those circumstances are like if the series or a book in the series gets nominated for the Hugo Awards. I will try to catch up on a series that I wouldn't otherwise necessarily continue. But these are all books where I am personally, internally motivated to read the next books in the series. So I'm going to be starting with what is most recently read for me in terms of when did I last read a book in this series, and then I'm going to be going backwards chronologically over the past 3 years. First is the only manga or graphic novel series on this list, and it's Witch Hat Atelier by Kamome Shirahama. I am 4 volumes in. I read volume 4 in September of this year. I had read the first 3 volumes a while back. I think I read them in 2023, and I gave each of those first 3 volumes only 3 stars each. They are kind of formulaic, middle grade-ish setup, but charming. Those first 3 volumes are kind of a story arc that come to a stopping point, and then I finally picked up volume 4 this year and felt like, oh, I understand, this is good. I think volume 4 is where things are starting to really pick up. And volume 4 did end on a cliffhanger, so I kind of have to keep reading. I have 5 and 6 out from the library to encourage me to do that sooner rather than later. I do want to point out that I really like the art style of this series. I especially like the costume design in this fantasy world. It's very good. Next is the Shadow of the Leviathan series by Robert Jackson Bennett. The first book was The Tainted Cup. There is now a second book out and a third one coming out next year. This won the Hugo Award for Best Novel this year. And I didn't read it until after it won. So I was reading this first book through the lens of, is this Hugo Award worthy? And I kind of found the whole Best Novel shortlist this year a little underwhelming. And I thought that I wouldn't have felt like The Tainted Cup was Hugo Awards material in most years. But that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. I did. I gave it 4 stars. It's a series I would probably continue with even if the second book doesn't end up being Hugo nominated next year. The second book is A Drop of Corruption, partly because the first book seemed like it was a lot of setup and I kind of want to see where it's actually going. This is a fantasy mystery series with a sort of a detective premise. that is set in this empire that is constantly fending off these giant titan monsters that come out of the sea. And there is all this like vividly weird world building going on that is the coolest part of the book. Book one, at least, I didn't think really dug into any of the big ideas presented in that world building particularly deeply. I am hoping that book two will do that more, and I am kind of expecting that it will, given the reviews that I've seen of book two, which have mostly been very positive. I would really like to continue reading the Kindom trilogy by Bethany Jacobs. This is science fiction. I have a full review of the first book in the series, These Burning Stars, on this channel. This trilogy is going to be complete soon if it isn't already. I think it will be eligible for Best Series at Hugo's next year. Again, I read this in August, but earlier in August. This is very edge-of-your-seat, plot-twisty space opera. Going back to March of this year when I was reading things to nominate for the Hugo Awards, and I was specifically looking for novellas that were not from Tor.com, I read The Mountain Crown by Karin Lowachee, which is the first book in a novella trilogy called The Crowns of Ishia. And I think both books 2 and 3 in this series came out this year. I gave this first book 4 stars. It is a secondary world fantasy with a Western-inspired setting that has dragons. And I think this is the sort of series where each book follows a different protagonist. Next is a duology that's now finished. This should be very easy to complete. The Sunken Archives duology by Sylvie Cathrall started with A Letter to the Luminous Deep. I read this in January of this year, and this series is now complete with A Letter from the Lonesome Shore. I gave this first book 4 stars. It is a very whimsical but also mysterious kind of light academia epistolary novel. There are 4 protagonists that are like 2 pairs of correspondents, the first of which are kind of the main couple, and we know from the beginning that they went missing and are presumed dead. And then the second pair of protagonists are their siblings who are writing to each other and exchanging their siblings' letters to try and piece together what happened to them. This was a book that had me like kind of guessing the whole time what was going on, both with the story, the actual central mystery, and with the world building. This is set in a world where there's a whole lot of ocean and not a lot of land, and the academic institutions of this world seem to be like really central to society. You've got this family that grew up in this underwater house that's an architectural marvel. So like a very, very cool setting. But I was trying to guess the whole time because there's very little magic in this. And then like just a little hint of what might be magic starts seeping in, but you don't really get any answers even by the end of this book. So I was guessing the whole time, is this some sort of science fiction? Are we on some planet that was colonized by humans at some point in the distant past? Or is this a portal fantasy of some sort? And I still don't know, and I desperately crave answers. And I am hoping that book 2 will give me all the answers. Next is a tricky one, because this is one where I technically only gave the first book in this duology 3 stars, and I know there are people who are gonna get mad at me about that because this is kind of a genre classic. But Dark Lord of Derkholm by Diana Wynne Jones is the first of 2 books that are a duology, companion novels. They go together. I had a whole journey with Dark Lord of Derkholm that had lots of ups and downs. I soft DNF'd this several years ago and then finally went back to it and got through it on audiobook in December of last year. This is a book for me where like the concept is 10 out of 10, 5 stars, brilliant genius. And then the execution just like made me frustrated in places. I also think this particular paperback edition that I have did the book a great disservice in how it described it on the back. I think this misrepresents this book in ways that sort of set me up for failure with it the first time. The premise of this is that it's set in a fantasy world, a sort of traditional epic high fantasy world, that has been plagued by tourism from our world via like portal fantasy. And they are stuck in this like magical contract with Mr. Chesney, the businessman, that they will run these pilgrim parties every year where all of these tourists get to trample all through their world and pretend that they're saving it from the Dark Lord. And over time, this has just caused so much unsustainable economic carnage that the power players in this world are at their wits' end and will go to any lengths to stop the pilgrim parties. They go to an oracle, and the oracle says, well, this year, if you want to end the pilgrim parties, you need to assign the wizard Dirk to be the Dark Lord, and his teenage son Blade to be the last of the wizard guides, bringing the tourist parties through the land. I'm giving you a better book description here, don't read this one. So the two main characters that we're following, with I think some exceptions throughout the book, are the father and the teenage son. And neither of them are particularly suited to these roles at all. And for the vast majority of the book, we are following this family, the two parents and the teenage kids, some of whom are humans and some of whom are griffins, trying very earnestly to pull off the pilgrim parties and make them actually work. This book is very, very slow to get to the point sometimes. It felt like the whole half of the book is just putting these irons in the fire for all the things that are going to go wrong later. And I didn't have a ton of patience for that for a couple reasons. First was the description on the book that promised me that the pilgrim parties would go horribly wrong, and I was like, I'm here. I am waiting for it to crash and burn. Bring on the disaster. But also, I think if you're reading this with an adult level of media literacy, you lock on to, at the very beginning, pilgrim parties bad, metaphor for, colonialistic tourism industry, that it's kind of hard to get behind that very earnest theater kid energy of the characters in this who are trying so hard to make the pilgrim parties go right. So half my issues with this were kind of structural, and then half were kind of tonal. This is a comedy. A lot of this is meant to be funny. I found very little of it to be ha-ha funny. There are very, very serious themes in this book that I think are very, very clever, and sometimes kind of at odds, I thought, with the silly, whimsical tone. The place where I DNF'd this the first time, there is a portion in the middle of the book where the teenagers are all forced to take on the task of moving this army of very unhappy, violent, dangerous, conscripted criminals from the prisons of our world and move them across the land from point A to point B. And it's difficult, it takes a long time, and it goes very badly in ways that I felt upset by, and I just couldn't, for me, square what was happening and the very serious social commentary that was absolutely intentionally there in that plot line, with the kind of glib tone. And there were a few other places like that in this book where there were very serious things happening that I didn't quite think were allowed to feel as serious as they needed to, because it was supposed to be a comedy. The ending in particular gets very dark, and then surprise, everything's okay, and that was such whiplash. There is this whole plot line about the strain between the parents in this relationship that is waved away at the end. We're oh, it was all magic, sorry, poof, it's fixed. I don't know, there is so much that is good in this book that I don't want to discourage anyone from reading it. But usually I wouldn't necessarily be thrilled to pick up the sequel to a book that I had struggled this much with. But this is one of those situations where I think the sequel takes place like some years after, and it follows some of the same characters but has, you know, its whole other story premise going on. And Year of the Griffin, second book, there are only 2 books, is one of those older fantasy novels that I want to read for specific reasons of how this fits in the history of the fantasy genre, completely independently of Dark Lord of Derkholm. This is one of the, I guess, more well-known magic school novels that existed prior to Harry Potter. And I want to read it for that sort of fantasy history reason. Frustratingly, I know I own a copy of this and I cannot for the life of me find it. I have no idea where it is. So I will have to find it before I can read it. Wish me luck. Next is an ongoing series that I've been so good at keeping up with. There is only 1 book out right now that I haven't read, and that's the Singing Hills cycle by Nghi. I read the 5th book in this series, The Brides of High Hill, last November. There's now 1 more book that's been released, A Mouthful of Dust, and this series is not done. There's going to be another one coming out next year, so I will be chasing this series, hoping to stay moderately caught up for a while yet. These are novellas. I like them all. They have all been 4 stars for me so far. Next is another duology where I only have to read the 2nd book, and then I'm done. The Manifold World series by Meadows starts with An Accident of Stars, and the 2nd book is Tyranny of Queens. These books have these newer editions from Angry Robot, and my library had physical copies of the new editions of the 1st book, and they do not have physical copies of the 2nd book. They only have the old ebook edition, so I think I'm going to have to read the 2nd book on ebook, even though that's not my preference. I read the 1st book in September of 2024, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. This is a multi-POV portal fantasy where the main protagonist, although there are several POV characters, is a teenage girl from Australia who follows this older woman she meets near her school. It turns out into a fantasy world by accident, and gets entangled in some of the politics that are going on in this fantasy world in very intense ways. I think if you've read Meadows' more recent books, A Strange and Stubborn Endurance and All the Hidden Paths, these are more similar than you would expect given the dramatically different premises. These series both have these very elaborate fantasy cultures in them and have protagonists that are experiencing a good deal of like culture shock. An Accident of Stars is also very queer, but not necessarily a romance. And it had like a shocking ending for me. There was something I did not see coming that was very upsetting, but also made me say I need to pick up book 2 immediately, and then I did not pick up book 2 immediately. I still need to do that. Next is the Greenwing and Dart series by Victoria Goddard, which might be the only self-published series on this list. The 1st book is Stargazy Pie, and I read the 2nd book, Bee Sting Cake, in May of 2024. And the reason I have not continued with these is because they are self-published books, and I need to go out of my way in order to get copies of them. They aren't readily available in bookstores where I shop, and I've just not been able to justify to myself splurging on the rest of the series online yet. This is not a completed series. There are 6 books already, and there are going to be more. But these were both so much delightful, silly fun. These books are like chaotic, cozy small-town fantasy of manners, where you would not believe the shenanigans this small town is somehow getting up to. The protagonist is Gemmis Greenwing, who at the beginning of book 1 returns home from university after a devastating series of personal events. He has this very complicated family situation going on where, like, his family in this context is his stepfather's second wife and the children she is raising from this line of marriages that happened to make that happen. Gemmis's father is believed to have been a traitor and is notorious for it. He's in a very precarious social situation in his hometown. And as soon as he gets home and takes a job in the local bookshop, weird things start happening. Here's the thing about this first book. I only gave this 3 stars because I felt I couldn't justify giving it more than 3 stars. My feelings about it were significantly more positive than 3 stars because I had a very fun time. But this is just such an intensely messy book in such a way that is so intrinsic to the nature of the story that, like, if you tried to edit the mess out of this book, you would have nothing left. You would have taken the entire heart and soul out of the book and you would be left with nothing. It's structured sort of as if it's a mystery novel, with the protagonist trying to, like, solve a local small-town mystery. But the pie that shows up at the beginning and is the first mystery is foreshadowing, because it's a fish pie. It's made of red herring. I realized this after I got to the end of the book and I was like, wait, we were told that everything in the book was red herrings right at the beginning. The protagonist of this book is so confused. We reading it are so confused because all of these crazy things keep happening and you would think that they were all clues to the same mystery, but a lot of them just are not. Gemmis doesn't even know what mystery he's supposed to be solving, and neither do we. There's also a lot of very intense world building, like in the backdrop of this series, where this is like part of a multiverse, that a bunch of this author's books and series take place in this same multiverse, where it's after the fall of this, like, multi-dimensional empire, where, like, you used to be able to travel between these universes and you can't anymore. And this happened, like, within the lives of these characters, like, some years before the start of this book, where, like, the connections between the worlds vanished and the nature of magic itself changed. And, like, there were all sorts of weird magical catastrophes happening all over the place. And, like, the early books in this series were written pre-COVID, but it sort of had resonance for me reading these first 2 books in a post-COVID world, that, like, this is a world where everyone is living in the aftermath of, like, a worldwide disaster, but kind of just getting back on with their everyday lives and pretending like everything is normal and fine. Even though there's this very clearly defined before and after, and we are living in the after, and things are not the same as they were in the before. There is also just, like, a shocking amount of detail about the places that are referenced in these books. And these both take place in one small town. And I was reading the second book and thinking, wow, I really need a map of this continent, because there's so many places that are, like, relevant that we don't actually go to in the books. Book 2, I gave 4 stars. It is less chaotic than book 1, but still extremely offbeat and whimsical. There is a dragon in this one, and, like, a cursed estate, and a foot race, and a cake baking competition. It also introduced a character I liked a lot and I'm hoping to see more of. So yeah, the next book in this series is called Whiskey Jack, and I need to just, like, buy it for myself. It's a treat. Next is a series where I have the second book out from the library right now, so let's hope that means I'll actually get to this soon. And this is the Investigations of Mossa and Pleiti series by Malka Older. The first book was The Mimicking of Known Successes, and I read it in February of 2024. There are now 3 books in this series. The second one is The Imposition of Unnecessary Obstacles. And I do really enjoy a good SFF mystery series. This is one, though, where I really enjoyed the first book while I was reading it, and then, like, it kind of dropped from the front of my mind pretty quickly. And I am pretty sure I'm going to be enjoying this just as much when I actually pick it back up to get into it, but I haven't been super motivated just because it wasn't one of those experiences where it was like, I need the next book now. These are science fiction mysteries that are a little bit cozy, following characters who live on human settlements around Jupiter. The 2 main characters are former girlfriends who are maybe having a bit of a second chance romance thing going on. And the second book has a purple cover. You know, I love a purple cover. I'm a sucker for a purple cover. Next is the Emily Wilde series. I have read the first 2 books, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies and Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. I read that second book in February of last year, February 2024. There is just one more book in this series to read. It's Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales. I think I'm gonna love this. The first book, I have a review of it on my channel. It was 5 stars for me. The second book, I didn't love it quite as much, but I was still very into it. Part of this is just like going into the first book with no particular expectations because I'd never read this author before. The author is Heather Fawcett, and I was just like so pleasantly surprised by how much I loved the first book. Then I went into the second book with very, very high expectations. And the second book specifically had like a scene very early in the beginning that to me was just like absolutely perfect. All the things I love about the books and the characters, and then like nothing else in that book lived up to that very early scene. I still think book 3 has the potential to be 5 stars for me. I am crossing my fingers for a 5-star read here. We are now going into series I last read a book from in 2023, so that's year before last. And this is a big one, the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois, McMaster, Bujold. I read The Warrior's Apprentice in November of 2023, 2 years ago. I had previously read the 2 books that follow the main protagonist, Miles's mother. Those are Shards of Honor and Barear. The protagonist of those books is Cordelia. So I've read 3 books in this series. Shards of Honor is like a pretty decent sci-fi romance that is outdated in some ways, but still likable. Barear is like a great court politics novel. And Cordelia is such a great protagonist, especially in Barear, that it is a little bit jarring to leave her behind and start reading about her like teenage son instead. Because in this book, Miles is very young and he is showing it. And I have all the faith in the world that he is going to be a great protagonist as the series progresses. But in this book specifically, which I gave 3 stars, he is absolutely not yet as cool as his mother. He is like frustratingly teenager stupid despite being a literal genius, if you get what I mean. But even though this one was 3 stars, I still like breezed through it and had a fun time. I'm terrible at like actually continuing with long, older series. It's not a thing I'm good at. I think the next book I read in order is The Vor Game. Correct me if I'm wrong. I did sort of start this at one point. I read like the first 2 chapters and was not in the mood. I will try again at some point. Next, I have 3 different series that I was reading during my No New Release-a-thon in October of 2023, and if you watched my video wrap-up from that readathon, which was actually a compilation of TikTok clips, in every single book, almost, I was like, I really want to read the next book in this series. Will I ever do it? I don't know. But the first of these is the Inheritance Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I read The 100,000 Kingdoms, which is the first book in this series, during that readathon. I gave it 3 stars. There were things that I didn't love about it, but I have absolutely no reason to believe that those will continue to be issues for me in the sequels, given that this is the sort of series where every book, I think, follows a different protagonist. And so it's a world that I definitely wanted to read more in, and I was genuinely very, very excited about picking up this second book, which I've had for ages, and I do not know when I will do it. The second book is The Broken Kingdoms. I don't have the third book, but at this rate I'll never get there anyways, so. Next I have a series I'm very close to the end of, and that is The Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. I read the 4th book in that series, In the Labyrinth of Drakes, during that No New Release-a-thon in October 2023, and I was so certain I was going to pick up this book in 2024, and having failed to do that, I promised myself I would read it in 2025. This might actually be the next book I pick up, because if I don't read this in 2025, and there's 1 month left of 2025, I'm going to be so mad at myself. So this one might be my next read. This is the last main book in this series, but there is one more spin-off novel that I also own. And these are books about the various adventures of a lady naturalist who studies dragons in a secondary fantasy world that is reminiscent of the 19th century. Okay, one more series from that October 2023 No New Release-a-thon, and that is the Riverside series by Ellen Kushner. The book I read was Swords Point. It's back there on the shelf. I have actually, I think, owned The Privilege of the Sword for longer than I've owned Swords Point. This happens when you're shopping for like old used mass market paperbacks. Sometimes you don't find the first book in the series first. In this case, I do think this is one of those sort of companion series where you don't actually need to start with the first book, and The Privilege of the Sword is kind of the one that I'd heard more about before I read any of them, so I did initially buy this one thinking I might start here, and I still haven't read it. This is fantasy set in a world with no magic. These were sort of early fantasy of manners, but with sword fighting. I talked about the first book in that wrap-up that I already mentioned. And the last official series on this list, though there are going to be 2 honorable mentions, the last official series on this list, I am so embarrassed that I still haven't read this final book in this series, but it is the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. I read book 5, Thick as Thieves, in January of 2023, and I still haven't read Return of the Thief. This has been, like, the book that I am nervous to read because what if I don't love it and it's, like, the final book in one of my favorite series? It's also one of my, like, break glass in case of emergency reading slump books that I'm just, like, too scared to ever actually use for that purpose. I don't know. I'm intimidated, I'm scared, I'm worried that I'm not going to love it as much as I want to. But I will read it. I will, I promise. And then there's also a short story collection, so it's not like it's all over once I read this one. This was a very, very long, drawn out in terms of its publication, YA fantasy series. The first book was really published before YA was a thing and was marketed as a children's book. Thick as Thieves, which was the last one before this one, honestly felt very adult to me. So the series kind of defies easy categorization, but right now they are published as YA. And they are political fantasy with just like the tiniest bit of magic, set in a Mediterranean-inspired fantasy world. And then my two honorable mentions. So I was pretty strict in order to not let this get over long, to limit this to just like series I have read from in the past 3 years. There are, however, two older series that I was all the way caught up on until this year when they both had new books released. And according to my rules that I set myself at the beginning of this video, those should be old enough that I should have to make myself go back and reread the earlier books before I read the new releases, and I just know I'm not going to do it. I think I'm going to dive into both of these new releases without rereading the previous books. The first is the Saint Death series by C.S.E. Cooney. The first book was Saint Death's Daughter. I have a full review of it on this channel. I read it in 2022, which was the year it was released. The second book came out this year. I have both of these books on my Kindle, and I don't think I'm going to reread the first book before I read the second one. I will be able to try to reference it if it turns out there's something really important I'm forgetting. But like, this is a very complicated fantasy series, lots of convoluted world building, lots of context, and I am not going to do that reread, even though I know I should. And then there was an even longer publication gap between the third and now fourth books of the Nevermore series by Jessica Townsend, which starts with Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow. The most recent book before the one that was released this year was Hollowpox, The Hunt for Morrigan Crow. I read this in 2021. I think that was the year after it was published. And the fourth book, which is Silverborn, The Mystery of Morrigan Crow, is out now. This is a middle grade series that I have just really enjoyed over the years, and I am so happy that book 4 has finally been published, even though I will probably be diving into it without remembering very much of what happened in the first 3. Anyways, thank you if you stuck around to the end of this rambling and thrilling long video. Let me know if you've read any of these series or if you're planning to. Let me know if you are a good series reader or a bad series reader like me. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.